All right, I'm Michael Hartzman. Today is actually not Tuesday, February 14th. Today is actually Friday, February 10th, about 1 p.m. in the afternoon. And we are pre-recording our show this evening because Tuesday is actually Valentine's Day. So who's ever's listening, happy Valentine's, everybody. And good evening to you, Dominic. How are you?
Doing well, Mike. Happy to be here and happy to at least try to give our families a nice Valentine's Day present by actually being there on
Well,
that
that's a
evening.
that's a giant leap of faith on your part, Dominic, that your family actually does want you home and around on Valentine's Day.
At least one person does, and we'll forget about the rest of them.
Well, happy Valentine's Day, my friend.
You as well.
So, it feels like it was just a blink of an eye when we actually did the show live on Tuesday with Lauren Goodwin. But here we are on Friday. And, look, to me, it was just, we talked about how busy the news cycle was up until Tuesday. And things really quieted down since then. It's just kind of been a normal blah market. I think this is the worst week we've had in 2 months. But again, I don't think it's anything to worry about. I think it was expected that the market would have a little bit of a sell-off. I actually think it's healthy. And here we are.
Yeah. So the call we did on Tuesday really focused on the prior week, the Fed meeting and their announcement on interest rates, and then of course the big job number that we had. So the market, that stuff is behind us at this point in the game, and the market refocused, I think, on what they should have been focusing on all along, Mike, and that is earnings. Are companies actually making money? Are their earnings improving or staying stable even? And we've had a few disappointments this week. And I think the markets are starting to realize, hey, wait a minute, maybe we don't have to worry about necessarily about a recession or at least a deep recession, but we do have to worry about that companies need to make money. And are we paying a fair value for these stocks? And so we've had a little bit of a retracement this week.
And even, Dominic, even if earnings was spot on, don't forget they're comparing it from last year, especially for the tech sector, which was a terrible year. And it's okay for the market to take a breather. It's not good for it to just continue to go up day in and day out.
Well, the NASDAQ in particular has had just an explosive start to this year. A lot of it on speculation, and it seems like the more speculative the investment was, the more it went up. Again, some of that air is coming out of the balloon. And then tech earnings in general have not been great, Mike. Now, they haven't been horrific. They haven't fallen off a cliff, but they have not been great. And I remind everybody that those earning projections had already been lowered by most analysts. So we have overall earnings disappointing, about 5% below analyst expectations. Not horrific, not the end of the world, but I think the markets are starting to realize, hey, wait a minute, we can't just let this balloon fill up indefinitely, and maybe some of the air is coming out of the balloon.
And I agree. But it's not only the earnings, right? We talked about this on Tuesday. While we talk a lot about the healthy job market and the great unemployment numbers we saw last Friday, we're probably 3-4 months into pretty heavy layoffs in the tech sector. That's been an outlier. And I think there were even more layoffs announced earlier this week by a few major companies. So I think that's also, contributing a little bit to some of the weakness.
Yeah, Mike, I think you're spot on, right? So part of this disappointing in the tech sector in their earnings number is that these companies now are looking at their own scenario, their own total number of employees, what they're paying for rental space. They're literally searching the seat cushions going, hey, we need to cut some costs out of this because clearly our earnings are not what we expected them to be. And so the combination of this disappointing earnings number, a lot, not all, but a lot of the layoffs are coming in the tech and growth area of the market, overhired in 2020. So, look, a lot of this is just, no, you don't ever want to see anybody lose a job, God forbid, but it is healthy that every company reevaluates itself, looks at the picture and says, are we doing the best thing? And that's a lot of the noise we're getting today.
Yeah, exactly. And I know it's counterintuitive because frequently Wall Street cheers when companies try to cut some fat. And like you said, it's not fat, it's real people with real lives and real families. And we feel bad when people lose their jobs, but it kind of cuts both ways, because Wall Street could say, okay, they're trying to get leaner and meaner, but also what happened that they got bloated in the first place. And sometimes Wall Street has to dissect exactly what all these changes mean. And that's why when we look at these unemployment numbers, you can look at it, glasses half full or half empty.
Exactly right, Mike. And let's not pick just on the tech sector. Wall Street itself and a lot of the big banks have announced layoffs. Look, last year was a very disappointing year in the markets, very disappointing years for mergers and acquisitions, a lot of the stuff that makes Wall Street a lot of money. And so they also have had to look internally and going, hey, we need to cut some costs here. And jobs is a big component. And when we see the headlines all the time, but their acquisition of technology, right? So where they buy new computers and software. And so it's kind of a wheel where one company decides to cut some costs that affects another company because the first company is not buying their product. They cut costs, which affects the next company. So this is a little bit of a rolling wheel. And I think we're going to see it for the foreseeable future.
And even Disney, well, Disney's earnings, when Disney's earnings were cheered earlier this week, they still announced 7,000 layoffs.
Yeah, again, in a big scheme of things, that's not a significant number unless you're one of those people that's just going to lose their job, right? But again, new management came back to Disney and they looked at the picture, and everybody's looking at bottom line, and profits again have been disappointing. How do we improve profits? You either sell more stuff or you cut costs, maybe both. I think that's the next phase of where these markets go.
Yeah. So tonight, Dominick, we have Harold Bollaci. He's a great resource for the two of us. He's someone that we frequently introduce our clients to. He's an estate attorney on Long Island, specializes in estates and trusts, Medicare, Medicaid planning. He actually was one of our first guests when we started doing the podcast, and we decided to bring him back because things are constantly changing. And we're looking forward to hearing Harold's point of view on some really important topics as it relates to Medicare, Medicaid, and how it relates to estate inheritance tax in our home state in New York.
Yeah, certainly one of my favorite topics. Not only do we pay taxes through our whole life, but then we may have, in some cases, substantial obligation when we die. So just because they didn't get enough while we were alive. So Harold will walk us through that. Sorry about the sarcasm there. And we're going to go through this with Harold. Clients don't believe. What do you mean I have to pay taxes when I die? So I think this is a very relevant topic, and I think Harold will walk us through the minefield.
We'll be right back right after this quick break. All right, I'm Michael Hartzman, back with Dominick Tavella and our special guest this evening, Harold Bollaci of Bollaci Law on Long Island. How are you, Harold?
I'm doing well. Good to see you. Thanks for having me back on the Lebenthal Report.
Welcome, Harold. Looking forward to our discussion this evening.
Thanks, Dom.
And you corrected us on your break. You're right. This is actually your third appearance. So thank you for your time.
3-timer. I mean, this is like Saturday Night Live. I get to be a 5-timer maybe one day. Remember that?
Yeah, we'll get you a Lebenthal sweatshirt.
I have a Lebenthal sweatshirt.
So listen, the first two shows we did, you were stashed away in your basement in the middle of COVID, and now it looks like you're in the middle of a beautiful golf course. So
yeah, I'm in
or a sheep pasture in Ireland. I'm not sure which.
That's right. The sound of music is behind me, Don.
So Harold, listen, we wanted to have you back because you and I and Dominick were talking a few weeks ago, and you said there was some really important changes for people who need to do Medicaid planning, and it's federally. So it's not just does not affect people in New York or Florida. It affects everybody. Right. So why don't we jump in there? Because I know this was something you really wanted to get the message out to our clients and your clients. So tell us what's happening in the world of Medicaid that people need to know about.
Sure. Well, as you know, Medicaid is a federal program that is administered by the states, and Medicaid is a health insurance program for people who don't have resources. I don't like to use the word for poor people. It's for people who don't have resources. And there are two types of Medicaid for estate planning purposes and just for purposes in general. There's institutional Medicaid, and that's where somebody would apply for government assistance to pay for their nursing home care. I'd like to talk a little bit about community Medicaid. Community Medicaid is where the individual still resides in the community. They're not institutionalized. So when we use the word community, we mean that the person's at home. And traditionally, an applicant could apply for community Medicaid, and there was no look back as far as the transfer of assets into a trust or gifting to family members or friends. You were able to really move assets out of your name so that if you were asked what your resources are, you don't have any other than your income. So importantly, and I think this is a fair proposition that the federal government has imposed, when you apply for nursing home Medicaid, institutional Medicaid, there's that 5-year look back. I think most of your listeners have heard about that look back period for Medicaid, and it's 5 years, which means that if Harold Bollaci is going into a nursing home tomorrow, I need to show that I have not had anything in my name for 5 years. Otherwise, I'm going to have to participate in my care, and there'll be certain penalties associated with my not having achieved that 5-year look back. So the federal government through the states has now implemented or will be implementing a 3-year look back for community Medicaid. And this is really important because community Medicaid is the resource that people look to first when there's a crisis, meaning mom or dad got sick, mom or dad had a stroke, they need somebody to come in and help take care of them, and they just don't have the money to pay for it. And the reason we're talking about a look back period is because lawyers like me help clients transfer assets out of their names so that they're not available to pay for their care. And we used to be able to do that. If Dominick called me up and said, Harold, I have a client, they're in urgent need of care, they still have a few $100,000 in their name, they own their house, I could transfer their assets into a trust and they would be getting community Medicaid within 30 days. Now it's a 3-year look back. And so that's 3 years that I'm going to call them the patient has to participate and pay for their care prior to Medicaid picking in and picking up the bill, if you will.
So Harold, let me kind of jump on that. Let's use I hate to say a real life example, but it's not unusual for a parent to move in with a child, right? That they need care, they need somebody to look over them, and God forbid they fall, and then things have progressively gotten worse, and they're in that situation where they need help. They're living in a house, say, with a child, but they need help. They need somebody to come in maybe a couple of days a week. Maybe that progresses eventually to go into an institution, but how do they start the process?
So I just want to say, I think Michael and I were talking the other day, and I indicated that I had a client paying about $5,000 a week for 24-hour home care. That's a lot of money. And even if you have it, that's going to burn through your savings very, very quickly. So to answer your question, though, Dominick, somebody needs the care. Mom's ill. She had a stroke. Maybe she needs 4 hours, 6 hours, 8 hours. The first thing they should do is speak with an attorney or a social worker about filling out a Medicaid application. And in doing so, they should look at the assets that they have, because if they have too many assets, for example, they should transfer their home into an irrevocable trust. If the client is sitting on a lot of money in a checking account, a savings account, a non-qualified investment account, that money should be transferred into trust prior to that Medicaid application being filled out. It's okay to do it sort of simultaneously because you're doing it. So it's not unusual for me to create an irrevocable trust, help my clients transfer those assets into trust. And just for clarification for your listeners, when I say transfer into trust, what the individual's doing and how they accomplish this transfer is they're technically gifting the asset to a trustee to hold for their benefit during their lifetime. And then that trust serves as a will substitute. So when the person who creates the trust passes, those assets pass through the trust to the beneficiaries that they have named in that trust. To continue to answer the question about the application process, when we started the conversation, I mentioned that Medicaid is a federal program that's administered by the states, but it actually gets further administered by every county's Department of Social Services. So as you know, my offices are in Nassau County. So if I had a Nassau County resident come in and ask me to prepare a Medicaid application, I'm submitting that application to the Nassau County Department of Social Services. And to the county's credit and to the Department of Social Services credit, they turn those applications around pretty quickly. I think we all know that sometimes government's slow. Trying to get things out of local government can be very time consuming. I have to give a lot of credit to the Department of Social Services and how quickly and efficiently they're able to make decisions on the applications. Can I continue to explain some of the procedures, or do you want to jump in with a follow-up question, Don or Mike?
Well, I guess we both have follow-up questions, but I think what you should be clear on is what little window do we have now to maybe avoid some of these pitfalls?
So if any of your listeners or clients or friends think that Medicaid might be in their future, they should start making the transfers now. The 3-year look back was set to go into effect in 2020. And like so many things, it was postponed because of COVID. But beginning March 31st, 2024, all applicants for community Medicaid will be subject to a 36-month look back. So if you go and apply on April 1st, 2024, and you haven't made those transfers out of your name, you're going to get penalized and you're going to have to use your resources to pay for your care for at least 3 years, or until you spend them down all the way until Medicaid will pick up the bill.
But if you do it now, the 3-year look back is not in effect.
It won't apply. Right. You have until that time, but we're all procrastinators. I'm a very accomplished procrastinator. And I'll tell you, I had a call the other day from someone, his father's 101 years old, and he wants to do Medicaid planning. And God bless him. I hope his father lives for another 10 years. You probably want to do this before mom and dad hit that century mark. Anyone in the 70 to 80-year-old range, that's a really good time to start doing Medicaid planning. And the challenge for a lot of people is you're giving up a little bit of control because you're giving something to an irrevocable trust. And that's how you can say, Dominick, what do you have? Nothing. It's all in my trust. But you can't be your own trustee. Thankfully, most people appoint a family member, usually a son or a daughter, but sometimes a brother or sister, to serve as a trustee. But you need to be pretty confident that that trustee is going to reflect your wishes and do what you want. And we get the frequent question. So does that mean I need to ask Michael every time I want to write a check? And the technical answer to that question is yes. So it's a really hard discipline for a lot of people to accept. But thankfully, when you make an application for community Medicaid, you're allowed to keep some things in your own name. And as inflation has increased, the government recently upped the minimums that individuals can keep in their own name. And for individuals, they've raised it to about $21,000. So that's a reasonable amount of money to keep in a checking account to have control over. And the guidance is you're just putting your nest egg in trust. You're putting the money that you don't use all the time in trust. And it's still there if you need it. And the trustee is authorized to spend it on your needs if you need it. But it's been set aside and protected so that your care will be covered by Medicaid. I mean, it's more complex than that. This is more of a mathematical equation, and it really
Harold,
depends.
I think you're right. I think the thing that we get the most amount of resistance is this giving up of control, right? But
Right.
2 quick points. You never would put an IRA or a retirement account inside the trust, correct?
No, in fact, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think you can put an IRA or
You'd have to
retirement
take it
account.
out and pay the taxes first. So
Right.
in terms of our clients, like, well, you have a pretty substantial amount in your retirement account. That's not going to go in the IRA. You have complete control over that, and you can take out distributions without having to ask for permission. And that's a pretty good hurdle to overcome the objection. And then even the trust does allow for income to be distributed. Am I correct about that?
That's absolutely right. You know, what's important to remember is if you're doing this because you're going to need care, at some point we all have to give up a little bit of control, and our health is most important. And that's why having good people managing your assets is important. You need to trust the sibling or the son or daughter that you're entrusting this money to.
Harold, I just want to clarify 2 things. One, you mentioned community care.
Yeah,
That's basically home care, correct?
right.
Okay. So when it comes to home care, you just can't bring in your next door neighbor or your niece, right? And expect them to get paid. You, if I understand this correctly, you have to find someone who's basically certified by the county or the state, kind of a Medicaid approved caretaker. Is that correct?
Yeah, but there's a great loophole. So God forbid you or someone you know needs care. They come in and they do an assessment, and they evaluate the patient's ability to feed themselves.
And
clothe
Harold, I'm
themselves,
sorry. They in this case is the
Meaning-
county social
meaning an
services.
agency, a nursing agency, somebody who represents the government. They're going to come in and do a need-based assessment, and they're going to say, oh, well, okay, you're unable to do certain activities. We believe you need 4 hours of care a day. You're completely immobile and bedridden. It's more likely you need 12 to 24 hours of care per day. But Michael, so there are approved agencies that send out that hire and deploy the home healthcare workers. You get agency care. So I work for an agency, and the patient engages the agency, and the agency deploys me to come and take care of mom or dad or whomever. But there's something in the state that permits a relative to take care of another relative and get paid for it. So I think that's a terrific loophole. And I don't know that it's a loophole. It's a terrific opportunity for family caregivers to get paid to take care of a family member.
And
So
typically at a lower cost than if they were going to hire an outside individual to come into that.
100% at a much lower cost. But so if the family's in financial need, to be able to get paid to take care of somebody you were taking care of already, I mean, that's an incredible perk, especially if you needed the money to begin with. I mean, it's not a lot, it's an hourly rate, but if you were already doing the work anyway, you can qualify, and you don't need any special, you don't need to be a registered nurse, you don't need to have any medical training per se to qualify to get paid to take care of a relative or anyone else for that matter.
So it doesn't have to be a relative. You could be very close with your next door neighbor and still qualify.
Right. If you were that person's caregiver, you can qualify to get paid to do that. It's called the Freedom Care Program.
Is there any hoops to jump through? Do you have to justify it? Is there anyone monitoring that? How does that work?
Does who have to justify it? The patient or the caregiver?
Both
Yeah,
primarily.
so they do have some systems in place where you have to clock in and keep a journal, and it's not the type of thing where you can go next door and clock in and go home and get paid to do nothing all day. I mean, like everything, I'm sure people take advantage of the system, but you do have to account for your time and clock in, and a lot of it is the honor system, but the person in need has already qualified for the need. So hopefully who's ever taking care of them is being a good caregiver, because that's the whole point of being a caregiver.
Got it.
Interestingly.
And one other point I just want to focus on, Harold, because you mentioned it. So the trust really just acts as a way to get your beneficiaries their assets when you eventually pass away. So it kind of takes the place of, or in addition to what a will would do, but you can use it as part of your estate gifting, inheritance planning. It's not just a standalone tool. You can use it as part of the larger plan here for your estate planning.
Absolutely. You just said it, and I said it earlier, a trust serves as a will substitute. And I think we should reflect on this. We're talking about qualifying people with resources for government assistance. We're making people poor on paper, and it's not unusual for us to submit Medicaid applications for millionaires, for people who own a home that's worth $1 million. And it's not unusual. We live in the New York metropolitan area. A lot of our clients have a lot of equity in their homes. They've been very blessed with good income in retirement and good savings. And this is a really generous program that the government permits us to transfer these assets out of the individual's name completely legally and protect all that wealth while still getting the government to pay for care. It's really an incredible proposition.
It is. We agree with you. That's why we want you to have you on to talk about it. I want to clear up one other misconception that I think Dominick and I hear all the time. You mentioned irrevocable trust, and there's also a revocable trust.
Right.
And frequently, a client will set up a revocable trust, and that basically is designed for probate avoidance and to make the distribution of assets more efficient.
Right.
But it's not going to provide any protection as it relates to Medicaid planning. Is that correct?
It's 100% correct. And it's really important that your listeners understand that. A revocable trust, by definition, is something that you have control over. It maintains your Social Security number. Most people serve as their own trustee on a revocable trust. And for most people, the primary purpose of revocable trust planning is probate avoidance. And also for those who want to put restrictions on bequests that they're leaving to beneficiaries. So it's a way to reach out from the grave and prevent a full distribution of an inheritance, if that's something that the creator wanted to do. Generally, they just serve as a probate avoidance mechanism. Whereas an irrevocable trust, as we mentioned earlier, you're not your own trustee. So somebody else is serving in that capacity. For your listeners understanding, people call trusts all these different things. People say, oh, it's a Medicaid asset protection trust. It's this kind of trust. There are two types of trust: revocable or irrevocable. Irrevocable accomplishes Medicaid protection, period.
And I'll throw one more in there, because I know we're talking about Medicaid protection, but it's also an asset protection tool, right? If you got into a car accident and got sued, or you had an issue, you own a company, you had an employee, a creditor coming after you, the assets that are in that irrevocable trust after this timeline become protected, right?
That's correct, because they're no longer in your name. If someone says, Tavella, what do you have? Nothing. And the trust has its own tax ID number. You're not in control of the asset. You just have a beneficial interest during your lifetime. So yes, a fair amount of our clients use them for asset protection purposes. For it's more common with business owners, small business owners who are worried about liability protection. It's not uncommon for those clients to use an irrevocable trust for asset protection purposes as well. Yeah.
Harold, let's switch gears. Let's talk about estate taxes, the inheritance tax. I think the federal level now is well over $12 million.
Yeah.
Spouses still have the privilege to inherit money from each other tax-free. But a lot of our listeners live in New York. In New York, it's not. So let me back up. So people generally focus on the federal estate tax, and they think, I'm good. I don't have anywhere close to $12 million. I have nothing to worry about. And they forget that they also happen to live in the state of New York. I think that threshold is half. But not only is it half,
much less than half, right?
yeah.
Harold?
The New York State threshold for 2023 is 6.58 million.
All right, so yeah, just about half.
So it's roughly half.
But there's also a cliff,
Yeah.
right? And you know, you count people's real estate, their first home, their second home, and you know, a lot of people are surprisingly close to $6 million. And it's not so much that they pay taxes after that, it's how that cliff works. And I wanted you to spend a few minutes, if you can, and explain to us the pitfalls of not paying attention to the New York State inheritance tax.
This is a great subject, and I know that a lot of your clients talk about it, and so do mine. So we just said that the New York State exemption rate is 6.58 million. Excuse me. So if you die with 5% more than that number, you fall off what we call the estate tax cliff. And what happens is your entire estate gets taxed. So it's not the difference between what you have and what the exemption is. It's a full taxable event, and it can be incredibly punitive. It's not unusual for people to end up paying hundreds of thousands of dollars in New York State estate taxes because they had an extra $100,000 in their estate. And to your point about real estate and portfolios, you know, a 5% differential isn't a big differential. It wouldn't be unusual if 2 or 3 appraisers went out and appraised real estate and there was a 5% differential. And that can make the difference between paying no estate tax and really being crushed because you go over that cliff and the entire, let's say, 7 million ends up getting taxed. And New York has a scale for their taxes, and it goes up to 16%. So all of a sudden, you didn't think you had any estate tax obligation, and now you're paying up to 16% of, say, $7 million. You're the financial guys. That's a big number.
It's
Well,
a big number.
Harold, and as you well know, because I think you helped us with a specific client case, I had 2 clients in the last 18 months that paid in excess of $600,000 to New York State. The kids were flabbergasted. They're like, oh, well, we knew dad, mom had done well, but I don't understand how we could owe this amount of money. And so, as you mentioned, it's not that hard to get up to these pretty lofty numbers.
It's not, and it breaks my heart because some, let's call it relatively basic planning, probably could have prevented or significantly reduced those tax bills. So how would you try to mitigate estate taxes in the state of New York? Well, the first thing you do is revert back to our conversation of 3 minutes ago and gift assets into an irrevocable trust so that they fall outside of your taxable estate when you die. Using an irrevocable trust for estate tax planning is a very valuable tool. Of course, you need to do it properly and file the gift tax returns. And for individuals who are doing this planning, there's always this hesitation. I don't want to lose control. I don't want to lose control. If you have the right trustee on your irrevocable trust, you can continue to maintain the continuity of your business through the irrevocable trust. You can buy and sell assets, you can buy and sell stocks, you can buy and sell real estate, you can run a corporation through your irrevocable trust, and you can keep it all out of your taxable estate. Additionally, for people who have assets that they expect to appreciate exponentially, they should get that asset into an irrevocable trust and capture that exponential gain outside of their individual taxable estate. There are other ways to mitigate estate taxes, obviously through some gifting during your lifetime. If you think you're at a certain age and you're kind of at that cusp and you see, all right, I'm at about 6.5 million, take the opportunity to do some giving during your lifetime. Can I offer one more element of tax
Please.
reduction? There's also a nice provision that we can include in an individual's last will and testament. And in the common vernacular, people call it a Santa Claus provision. And it's a provision that we write into a will that permits the individual to make a charitable gift out of their estate to help reduce the size of their estate for estate tax purposes. So the language would be, in the event that my executor sees that, not that my executor, in the event that my estate reaches this certain threshold, I direct my executor to make a bequest based on this amount to this charity, and you're allowed to make charitable contributions out of a last will and testament. And that's a really easy way to protect yourself and get your estate down below the taxable level. So it allows your estate to make a charitable bequest to bring you below that threshold and keep you from falling over the cliff.
That's interesting. I didn't know about the Santa Claus provision. And there's also one other asset that kind of very stealthily could get snuck in there to pop you over, and that's a life insurance policy.
Yeah.
Right? Those are the proceeds. So
Sure.
we tell people all the time, the life insurance proceeds are income tax free, right? You normally don't have to pay taxes,
right.
But doesn't death benefit become part of someone's estate?
It does. Yeah.
And we see this mistake all the time.
All the time.
Someone will go buy $1 million life insurance policy because they want to protect their heirs, but they're the owners of that policy. So that whole $1 million becomes part of this taxable estate. You may end up giving half of it away in the form of death taxes, estate taxes.
It's frustrating, and I think it's interesting that you mentioned life insurance, because some sophisticated clients will take life insurance policies to pay for estate taxes, which is a very effective planning tool. It has to be done, very carefully with financial advisors like yourselves, because you don't want to create more problems than you may already have. But it's not unusual for people to take out some type of life insurance policy for the express purpose of paying taxes. And the reason they'd use an insurance policy to pay taxes is because perhaps their estate just isn't liquid enough. God forbid you die in a down market. You wouldn't want your heirs to have to sell something below what you'd expect the value to be, just because of the timing of having to sell it to meet a tax obligation. So for people interested in really complex tax planning, life insurance is also a way to mitigate the damage to the gross estate.
And just to be clear, you do need professional advice. You do need an attorney, because again, you have to purchase that inside of what's called an irrevocable life insurance trust. And you have to get that basically recertified every year through what you call crummy letters.
Right. Very important. I'm glad you mentioned that.
Harold, maybe a question you don't want to give us your opinion on, but I think I saw an article that some 100,000 millionaires left New York State last year alone. And we know about the income tax implications of living in a high tax state. But how does this estate issue affect these people?
Well, they're avoiding estate taxes too. They're no longer domiciled in the state of New York. And I think that statistic is probably fairly low. I think a lot more people left.
Oh, a
And
lot more
that's why-
people left.
Yeah.
They just
They're millionaires.
focusing on people that made $1 million a year. And you would think if you're that kind of high income earner, your overall estate is probably pretty substantial.
It is, and that's why you see a lot of New York billionaires no longer live in New York and no longer consider New York as their domicile. They're going to Florida, they're going to Puerto Rico, they're going to Texas. And it's a discipline, and it's a hard discipline. New York does not let their millionaires go lightly, especially for those who are trying to maintain a residence here and come back for the season. So it's something you have to be very careful with, and the state is onto it, and they're auditing people. And so if people are electing to move at least part-time, you really have to move. You don't get, it's not like, 10 years ago where, you did your 180 days out of the state and that was it. You really need to cut the cord, if you will, and get out of New York for that time period, because they're looking at people. And that's gonna bite a lot of people, unfortunately.
And by cut the cord, you can't vote in New York State. You can't have a car registered in New York State.
That's right.
You got to plant your new flag in another state.
You do. I have clients who season out of New York, and I mean they winterize their houses. They empty the refrigerator. You've abandoned that property. It's not like back and forth anymore. You really left New York. Because the state needs the money, and I get it. And people have been very lucky in availing themselves of these opportunities, but they're looking now because there's so much money leaving New York.
Yeah, I would just suffice to say that if that's something you're contemplating, you really should speak to a tax attorney and somebody who specializes in this field. I agree with you, Harold. It's not like, I spent half the year outside of the state. It's not that simple anymore.
Right. I mean, I remember friends and clients who'd say, oh yeah, I left New York. So every morning I go down to Starbucks and I buy it on my credit card so that if anyone ever asks where I was in Palm Beach every day, and you can see, because I went to Starbucks every day, and you can see my American Express card. That's not enough anymore. You have to go.
Yeah. And look, and you're right. The state needs the money, and people, you can't sneak into the city, right, or back to the state, because everyone has an easy pass. I mean, it's really easy to track people. I mean, they can track people on their phone. Correct.
And I wouldn't be surprised if they were doing that, if they needed to.
Well, everyone has a GPS on their phone. It's not that difficult.
Right. I don't think the New York State Department of Taxation and Finance has the manpower to enforce all of that. But if you end up in a pool of people that they decide to audit, they do have the resources to do that. So if they audit 1% or 5% of the people who left New York or tried to leave New York, and you don't meet the criteria that they think you need to meet.
And let's be honest, Harold, they're not going to audit somebody who's making $50,000 a year.
No,
right?
not at all.
Right.
If they have the resources, they're going to go where the money
They're going after the money,
And
Don.
so they're going to
Right.
go after the millionaires and the billionaires and make sure and document that the exit from New York State is legit. And again, I'm going to counsel anybody who's even thinking about this. And we get this question all the time, right, Mike? I'm going to move to North Carolina. I'm moving to Texas. I'm moving to Florida. It better be legit. It better be documented legit. You can't fluff it anymore.
It's much easier to come into the country than it is to leave New York.
Harold, I want to spend our last few minutes talking about the clawback, because you mentioned a couple of times about the gifting and the 5-year look back. And I get this question a lot. I think, what's the number this year? $16,000.
Yeah.
That any one person could give to any other person. But the question I also get is how serious or how frequently do assets actually get clawed back? I mean, you mentioned manpower. I mean, is there I know, and I don't want to put you on the spot. I don't want to advise anyone on breaking the law, but
No.
but how serious does either the state or the government, federal government, go after people and try to claw back gifts?
It's very hard. You just mentioned it. The state just doesn't have the manpower or the resources. Where we see the most amount of money getting collected on Medicaid liens is, for example, I end up in a nursing home. Medicaid pays for my nursing home care because somehow I was able to qualify. And I owned a home and they weren't aware of it. When my heirs go and submit a probate proceeding or an administration proceeding to settle my estate, that's when they put the Medicaid lien on. To New York State's credit, I think the courts are now finally talking to the Department of Taxation and Finance. So if I were to die today and I was a Medicaid recipient and my family put my will in for probate in Nassau County Surrogates Court, that would alert the New York State Attorney General's office that there's an asset available and they will put a lien on it for the Department of Taxation and Finance. So that's where I see the most, we use the word clawback, that's where I see the most money being recovered by the state, because technically the individual had the resources. They just were lucky enough to qualify for Medicaid. And Medicaid is for poor people. So if you had that resource in your name still and you died with it in your name, it's not unreasonable that some of that money should go back to the state for paying for your care during your lifetime.
But all the reason Harold, and not necessarily from Medicaid planning, because a lot of our clients wouldn't qualify, but for all the other reasons we talked about, we counsel clients all the time. At the very least, think about transferring your home into the trust, right?
Yeah.
It's not something you're going to liquidate. It's not something that you're going to spend down. Name your kids as trustees, somebody you trust implicitly. You get to live in it, but putting your home inside the trust is probably one of the easiest things to do.
It's so easy, and you're not going anywhere. You're not using it.
And no one could kick you out.
And nobody's kicking you out. And hopefully you're not putting debt on your primary residence when you're 75 years old. And I think another key thing here that the three of us talk about often is you need to make sure you make those transfers into trust. You need to make sure you retitle those non-qualified accounts and those checking accounts and the money markets and the CDs. And you need to make sure those deeds are recorded and transferred into trust. There's so many stories of people, they hire me to do the trust work and then they don't fund the trust. And then I have examples of, I had an example this week and it broke my heart. The parents did incredible trust planning, but over an 8-year period, they took everything out of trust and then they went and passed away. So what was the whole point? The kids are saying to me, but mom and dad put this stuff in the trust. Why isn't it in the
Harold,
trust anymore?
maybe we'll close on this one. I have 2 cases where they did the parents did all the trust work, all the trust planning, transferred the assets into the trust. And the kids were like, I don't really care. We're going to spend every nickel of it to take care of mom. I'm like, listen, it's your money. God bless. I don't get a vote on this, but they did the planning. Like, we don't care. All the money is going to be used for their care. And like, your choice, right? The trustee decides.
It's frustrating for us because we're so focused on wealth preservation and asset protection. And so that's where I think our collective frustration probably comes in. But you need to use them correctly. It's not just a pile of papers in a binder. It needs to be utilized correctly.
Harold, we could keep going. We could keep going, but unfortunately we're out of time. We probably share between the three of us between 75 and 100 clients, I'm guessing conservatively. You're a great resource to both Dominick and I, but anyone who's listening who has not availed themselves to your service, how do people get hold of you?
Thank you for asking. They can call my office at 516-538-9700. And my website is bollacilaw.com.
Well, thank you,
Thanks,
Harold.
Harold.
Thank you, Dominic. Thank you, Michael.
You're welcome. So Harold, I wish you and Evan a happy Valentine's Day. And Dom, I wish you and Patty a happy Valentine's Day as well.
And
Same to you and
Donna.
Don.
Thank you. Happy Valentine's Day, everybody. And we'll see you next week.